Hi, I'm Gabriel Filippelli. I'm a Chancellor's Professor of Earth Sciences at IUPUI, where I also direct the Center for Urban Health. A lot of my work, my research and teaching work has been around the concepts of climate change impacts as well as other environmental impacts. And so it's become very clear to me that these impacts are, in many cases, clearly disproportionately borne by people with less ability, less enfranchisement in their communities to handle them. So they're classic examples of environmental injustice and even environmental racism. Certainly, my work on lead exposure, urban lead exposure, is an example of the latter, environmental racism, where largely low income communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by the harmful effects of lead exposure that's been unabated and the consequence of that, which is lead poisoning. But for the context of today, I wanted to talk about climate change as an environmental injustice driver. And to put this in context, I want to explain climate change science just briefly. Contrary to maybe what people have heard in the media and so forth, climate change is already here. It's already impacting communities and impacting livelihoods, and it will continue to do so in the future. Even if we simply turn off the source of climate change, which is carbon emissions to our atmosphere, so turn off the tap, the tub will certainly still remain at the same level that we have it now. In other words, the amount of carbon dioxide will remain at what it currently is. And so it's key to not only turn off the tap, but try to find ways to open the drain to drain out some of that excess CO2. But certainly the best case scenario, I don't think will be achieved, meaning we turn everything off this year. It's just simply impossible. But we should be certainly prioritizing turning off the tap this decade, if not by 2035 or so. And of course, the ones who turn off the tap first should actually be the ones who have had the biggest impact, which are the Western countries, the developed world. Most of the carbon up in the atmosphere is actually from us anyway, and it's only the late players like China and India who are now dominant current emitters of carbon, but certainly their historical load has not been anywhere near what ours is. And so by having the developed world turn off the tap faster and to utilize our ability to adapt and switch over to renewables, we'll be able to kind of stepwise work in toward even the developing world and help them leapfrog the point where we're at now, leapfrogging technologies to renewables more quickly. So that's the climate future. But let's talk a little bit about environmental justice impacts. And I would like to start this off with a personal story. I was a Peace Corps volunteer on the small island nation of Kiribati. It's been inhabited for about 1,500 years by Kiribati people, so people from the country of Kiribati. That country is among the least developed countries in the world, meaning that their net emissions of carbon dioxide of the entire nation of 100,000 people is less than my emissions in a week. So think about that a little bit. This is a country that has not contributed at all to climate change in any tangible way. But here's its vulnerability. This country, this island nation, is exactly at sea level. The atolls that comprise it are barely peak above the ocean level. And the fresh water, the only source of fresh water they have, are these small lenses that are captured underneath these island strips, these narrow strips of coral reef. And it's captured by simply rainfall coming in. As the sea level rises, because of largely the melting of ice sheets, as well as a little bit the thermal expansion of the ocean, as it rises, it does a couple things. One is it has a tendency to erode the beachfront of some of these islands. That's sort of a more minor point. The more major point is as it rises, it increases the pressure of salt water. Salt water is constantly coursing through these these limestone atolls and chiseling away at that small little window of fresh water. It's fine in one sense because it is replenished by more rainfall from above. So it's sort of this harmonic balance, right? But that balance is losing out as rainfall patterns have not changed. In fact, rainfall has decreased in this area. And the pressure of seawater has increased. It means that a lot of the wells in parts of the country, especially those near the edges of the atoll, are already turning brackish, meaning you can't drink them. And you might say, well, can they filter them? Can they bring bottled water to the country? In context, most of the countries get a delivery by ship. Most of the islands in the country get a delivery by ship about every 2 months or so. And not only that, but there's very little air transport available. And there's no electricity or running water on any of these islands except for the capital island. So the solutions that we might immediately think of simply don't work. As a consequence, that country is expected to be denationalized by 2050 or shortly thereafter. What that means is that significant portions, if not all of the population of that country, this is in the worst climate scenario, will flee the country, and they've prepared for that by buying land in Fiji and Australia. So imagine a country that is contributing zero to climate change will be one of the first victims of climate change. And that is an environmental injustice of massive proportions. Not that it's a tremendous number of people, but this is a sovereign nation with its own language, its own culture, its own deep history, which will effectively be destroyed by the actions of climate change. This is not the only country. There's a number of other Pacific Island nations, as well as Indian Island nations, in the same boat, as it were. A boat that simply can't rise with the rising tides of sea level rise. But we can even come a little bit closer to home and look at environmental injustice issues right here in the U.S. And that involves a lot of the coastal communities. A lot of the coastal communities are very hard hit by sea level rise, which causes, of course, property loss. And those vulnerable people, so lower income people, are obviously more vulnerable to economic peril, as it were, from that loss. Whereas the condo dwellers with their property, with their homeowners insurance, who are occupying the thin little slivers of barrier reefs around barrier islands around South Carolina and Florida and so forth, they're fine. They have insurance. They'll recover. They'll be covered. But that's not the case for many coastal communities that simply don't have that capacity. Finally, I want to wrap up on environmental injustice issues right here in the state of Indiana. Indiana is expected to experience significantly more extreme rainfall events. In fact, it already has. Climate change is already here, as I mentioned. These extreme rainfall events will cause flooding, and it will also cause severe water quality issues. Those issues have been shown to hit low-income communities of color the worst, the hardest, along with heat waves, expected increased heat waves, where some of these communities simply don't have the capacity to air condition their homes because they simply can't afford it, which is one of the mitigating strategies. So climate change has a number of global, national, and local impacts on environmental health of communities. And those impacts are not borne similarly across race or income level. So we really have to think about not just fighting against climate change, which means reducing emissions, but mitigating and ameliorating the damage that's caused to lower income communities of color and providing them with the resiliency tools, the same resiliency tools that we happily hand out to wealthy homeowners in the form of property insurance, but we tend not to think about our neighbors, even right here in Indiana, who need that assistance. So I look forward to this conversation, and thank you for listening.